welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be talking about the last property related to text and fonts, and that is font family. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but in the next few videos, we're going to be actually looking at how to include external fonts, which is going to be a very fun activity, and that's going to really change the way that we use CSS. But before we do that, we need to learn about font families. So first of all, if you don't already know, a font family is basically a collection of fonts that have similar features. So there are three main font families that you can use: serif, sans serif, and monospace. So first of all, let's talk about serif fonts. So serif fonts have these small lines on the end of some letters, and pretty much every or a lot of the academic papers and printed out documents use these serif fonts. So right now, for example, our font is a serif because you can see these tiny lines at the end of some of the letters. So these are used very commonly on, like I said, papers, essays, journals. Anything that's pretty much printed out or given to you physically is usually going to use a serif font. But unfortunately, it makes it very hard to read on the computer. So there's actually another group of fonts which is the sans serif group. And if you don't know, sans serif groups are basically the fonts that don't have those lines, if it's not obvious enough from the name. So right now, this is a serif font. A sans serif font, on the other hand, would not have those lines. It would look a lot cleaner and easier to read. Now, a lot of the websites that you use today, so for example, pretty much all the news websites, if you've used WordPress before, that also uses sans serif fonts unless you specify otherwise. Google, Facebook, pretty much every website that you see commonly today, the big ones, usually always use sans serif fonts because they're much easier to read. So those are the two main groups, but like I said, there's also a third one, which is called monospace. So monospace is pretty much where all of the characters have the same width. So they all take up kind of the same space, each character. Whereas something like this, you can see that each letter kind of takes a different amount of space depending on what the letter is. So some pretty good examples of a serif font are Times New Roman, which is probably the most famous, and Georgia. Some pretty good examples of sans serif fonts are Arial and Calibri. If you've ever used Google Docs before, Calibri is a pretty common font. And then a pretty good example of a monospace font is Courier New, if you know what that is. Courier New is one of the monospace fonts, but like I said, there's many more out there that you can use. Like I said, it all depends on what family you pick and what kind of result you're trying to achieve out of your font. Are you trying to make it readable? Are you making a paper or a journal? It all depends on what you want out of your document. So in this case, because we're doing or creating a website, we're going to want to use sans serif fonts. So in order to specify a font family, or in specific a font, you're going to have to use the font family property. So if you go ahead and set font family, now this isn't just for setting the family, this is also for setting the specific font, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and say sans serif. So this is the font family that I want, and watch what happens to our page now. You can see that it looks completely different. We can actually read everything and it looks a lot cleaner. So that's why I like sans serif fonts, and that's why most developers much prefer sans serif fonts over serif fonts. You can see that it just looks a lot easier on the eyes. It's just much easier to read and use. But like I said, you don't just have to specify the family. You can actually specify the specific font. And you can actually do this using the comma separator. So first of all, I'm going to set Times New Roman as the main font. And then I'm going to insert a comma and then serif. So I'll explain this right now. First of all, if a font has more than one word or it's separated by spaces, you're going to need to use quotation marks to contain it. Now, the second thing is this comma here. Pretty much what's going to happen is if Times New Roman is available, use that as the font. But if it isn't available, then fall back to the standard serif font. So you can actually include more than just Times New Roman on here. So you can include 3 or even 4 layers sometimes. But for now, we're just going to use 2. And we'll talk about including very specific fonts in the next 2 videos where we're going to be including these external fonts. So there we go. Pretty much what this is saying is set the font family, in this case the font, as Times New Roman. But if Times New Roman isn't available, maybe, if you're using an external font, maybe the server has crashed, or maybe it's just not available on the browser, then use the serif family, just the general serif font. So if I actually go ahead and remove this, you're not going to see much of a difference between Times New Roman and serif. Like I said, you can see there's not much of a change because they're pretty much the same thing, but it is there. And if you use a different serif font, such as Georgia, there will be some sort of a difference between the two. You can see that. Now, although they aren't exactly the same, you can see they both contain those lines, things like that. So that's why you commonly use more than one font, just in case maybe if you're using a different browser, maybe someone's using a very old browser like Internet Explorer 6 or 7, then you can use some of the older fonts. So there you go. That's pretty much it for font families. It's really not that hard to grasp, and once you really get into it, it becomes a very, very useful tool. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just change this. But like I was saying, it becomes a very useful tool once you get into the later parts of web development, because changing the font can completely change the look of your site. So that's just one thing you want to keep in mind. All right, let's move on.